Okay, so this is the first class, and this one's, just sort of an overview, but this is all about what you need to know to be a beekeeper. Um, so the first thing is there's a lot to learn, and there's evidence that we've been learning about bees since prehistoric times, which means there really is just a lot to learn, and so that's something you need to keep in mind. Um, so what do we know for sure? Well, for the most part, no two beekeepers have the same opinion. So if you were asking different beekeepers things, you'll probably get different information and advice. Um, there's a lot of research going on, and we keep finding out things that we thought were true that are not necessarily the case. So one of the questions that came up along the way is about the book that I recommended, the Beekeeper's Handbook, because there's a new edition coming out in April. I like this book because the pictures are really good, the basics are really good. The things that are going to be in the new version are primarily on dealing with pest and varroa mites and the viruses they vector in particular. And that's always the case. It's by the time the book comes out, there'll probably be new research. As I said, we're learning something new every day. And I've been at conferences where experts are speaking on whatever their research is about, and they're up to date on whatever they're researching, but they may not be aware or up to date on what other apiary scientists are doing. So, for example, I've heard people talk about in conferences. People talk about that varroa feed on the blood of the bee. And, a few months before that conference, there was research that came out of Penn State that said that, in fact, the varroa is actually feeding on the fat body of the bee. So, we're just always going to have conflicting information out there, and there's always going to be something new. So we just sort of roll with it. And so that's just something to keep in mind. The other thing that's really true is what works in one area of the country, and even within a state, is not necessarily going to work in another part. The other part of that is what works in one part of the year will not necessarily work in another part of the year. So there's just it's always changing. There's always something going on. This is really important to keep in mind because we do a lot of research and checking on things on the internet, and there's lots of people who are very successful in keeping bees in different parts of the country, and their experience is just going to be different because their environment is different. I know that where my bees are in Summerfield, um, it's changed quite a bit. They started doing building across the street, and that really changed the whole makeup of how my bees were doing and how I had to take care of them. It depends on who you have around you. So if you have other beekeepers around you within 2 to 3 miles who are not necessarily good beekeepers, you could have issues related to that. Um, I have friends out in Reedsville who have no other beekeepers around them and lots of flowering trees and plants, and they grow things. And so the bees always have lots to eat, and so their experience is way different. So that's just something to keep in mind. And as we go through the classes, we'll talk a lot more about things related to figuring out what's right for your bees and what you should do in your particular area at specific times of the year. And then the other thing I'll just say is you need to trust your instincts and trust your bees. Bees adapt to their beekeeper. And so for sure, something that may work for you may not work for somebody else. You're a different beekeeper. As you develop more understanding of your bees and spend time with your bees, things that people tell you are just not going to feel right. And, you're going to just have to learn to trust yourself. It's the same kind of thing that happens around medical advice. You know your own body, and sometimes people will suggest things that just isn't going to work for you. Or if you have children, I'm sure you get lots of advice on what you should do for your children, and sometimes that doesn't feel right either. So the bees are kind of in that same vein. So those are things that we know for sure. So a little bit about how this class is going to work. Bees adapt to their environment, and so we need you to keep an open mind. Some of the things that I say and some of the things that other beekeepers that I invite along say may not, you may not agree with, but keep an open mind on it, because I find that along the way, I find that there's an element of truth in all those things. So, and it's a lot of information, so don't get bogged down by that. Just sort of let it come in and absorb what you can, and, just kind of keep going, and don't be too hard on yourself. So in addition to having been learning about bees and keeping bees for about 13 years, I started learning about bees when I was still in Texas, and I've been keeping bees since 2011 in North Carolina. I was also a project manager, and different classes are set up different ways. This one is going to be a little different because of critical path. So if you're a project manager, you know something about critical path. So that's kind of how I'm setting things up for this class. So critical path in this case means it's time to order bees, but you need to know a little bit about where you're going to go with them and what equipment you're going to be using before you can decide how you're going to order bees. So that's kind of what this overview is about. We're going to talk about a few different things, but one of the things is to give you some ideas about what you need to be thinking about before you actually order your bees. So today we're going to cover some of the basics. And understanding that things are very different now than they were even 10 years ago. And we're going to talk about what's to come, and I'm willing to adapt just like the bees. So we'll just kind of go with it, and as you guys decide that maybe you need more of one thing and less of something else, we can adapt to that. Most of the future classes will start with questions, so bring your questions. And we'll just kind of adapt as we go. Next week, we'll be focusing on equipment, both hive equipment, other equipment you'll need, including protective clothing. And as I've said, I've invited other beekeepers to join us along the way. So at various points, we'll have other people sharing their experience and what they know. Just a bit of semantics here. You'll see honeybee spelled both as one word and two words. If you're looking at European posts, they spell it as one word. Here in America, it's two words. And so I try to do two words for the most part and try to be consistent about it, but you might see both, and it doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter, but that's just for sort of FYI kind of thing. So the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is about the honeybees in the US, and why it is that the beekeeper in my family was my grandmother, and my grandmother had they had a 200-acre farm in southwestern Pennsylvania, and they had hives, and the hives would swarm, and they would catch the swarms and put them in other boxes, but mostly the bees took care of themselves, and they would just take honey from them. They didn't really have to do anything very specific. That's really not the case much anymore. So the first thing is there's relatively new evidence that there were actually honeybees in the Americas about 14 million years ago, but they went extinct. So there's a lot of talk about the fact that the honeybees are not native to America. The honeybees we have now are European or Western honeybees, and they were first brought to the United States in about 1622. And then, like I said, with my grandmother, it wasn't a big deal to keep bees. But starting in about the 1980s, it started to change because there were all kinds of various things that we were starting to see that, we didn't have before. And so what happened in the 1980s? Well, these two things. hold on a second. So the first one, I have a cat that likes to get in the way, so sorry about that. So the first one is the Varroa destructor, which came to the United States in about 1987, and it came from Asia. And that one actually continues to be our worst pest, and the thing that makes the biggest difference in how we manage bees these days. The other one was the small hive beetle. It came in 1998. It came from Africa. And so those are the two big ones that changed the way we do things in the beehives. So just a little bit of background on bee losses. You hear a lot about the bee losses. So the Bee Informed Partnership does a bee loss survey every year. So the one for the 2019 2020 report just came out. It's like from spring 2019 through winter, January, February, March kind of thing of 2020. And so according to the Bee Informed Partnership, and they got, they get about 10% of the beekeepers in the United States responding, at least 10%. So it's a pretty reliable response. Anyway, so during the winter months, across the country, it was about a 22.2% loss. During the summer months, it was 32% loss, and that was really unusual. Through the years, we've seen big losses through the winter, but not necessarily big losses through the summertime. And this particular loss was the highest ever recorded. So annually last bee season was about, well, the 2019-2020, we don't really know yet for last bee season because we're not quite through it yet. The annual losses were at 43.7%. That's a lot of bees. That's a lot of hives lost. In North Carolina, according to the same report, in the winter, we had 24.41% losses, and in the summer, 22.13 losses, and then annually 38.54 losses. That's a lot of bees. That's more than we typically get. Normal used to be about 15% for the year, and a really bad year was, 25% to 30%. So it's way higher. So, and like I said, the varroa mite is the big one. So the varroa mite vectors, the last I heard was about 22 different viruses. Maybe it's 24. We continue to find more information. So anyway, it accounts for most of the deaths in the US. And so one of the things you're gonna need to do is monitor your varroa count and treat if necessary. That's the big one. That's the one that'll get your attention for the most part. And if you don't do it, your bees will die, and that's not good for you, but it's also not good for your neighbors. So I have a beekeeper, I don't think she's still keeping, but she's within about 2 miles of where my bees are. And she was basically raising bees for honey. And so she'd get new bees every year and let them make a lot of honey and then sell the honey, and the bees would die. Well, what happened was they would also swarm. So we'd have sick bees, coming over, and some of those would get into my hives. But the real problem was their bees would die, or they'd be really sick and not be able to defend their colony. And so my bees would go over there to steal their honey, and they would come back loaded with varroa. And it was just, I lost hives that way because it happens really fast, and there was really no way to get ahead of it. So, be a good neighbor as well. And one of the reasons that I do these classes is to try to get people to understand that, taking care of our bees is really important, and that what you do and what happens in your bee yard may affect other people. So it's in a way for me to help protect my bees. And in North Carolina, we have two big nectar flows. One is in the spring and one is in the fall. And we've had a lot of rain in the springs, and a lot of times our spring nectar flows primarily in the flowering trees. And so they get washed out, and so there's not a lot of food for the bees. So nutrition is a really big one, and it's really not uncommon for bees to starve to death in February. They don't have enough food to get them through. They have enough food to get them through the winter. It's when they start to lay brood in the early spring, middle of January, where they need a lot more food and there's new bees coming on, when they actually starve to death. So that's not uncommon. It's not cheap to have bees. So it's not unusual to spend about $500 getting going, and that's just one hive. And according to research, about 80% of new beekeepers quit within the first 2 years. If you go through 2 years and you've lost all your bees during the winter or even during the late summer, that's really discouraging. But I just want to point out that you may need to hang in there a little bit longer if you're really serious about this, because it might take you 2 years to learn enough about your bees to be able to take care of your bees. I think my first 2 years in North Carolina, I lost bees both years. I started off with 2 hives the first year. And I think going into winter the second year, I had 3 hives, and I maybe made it through with 1 hive, but it was pretty discouraging. But after that, it seemed to get easier. I knew better what to look for. So in getting started with bees, you have to remember that it's different these days for most people. It depends on where you live, but for most people, especially if you're in an urban environment, it's going to be no different than animal husbandry and raising animals. And in North Carolina, the Department of Agriculture has an apiary science group, and we have normally we have 6 apiary inspectors. Right now we're down to 5 because one just retired. And so there are guidelines, there are regulations about bees, and incidentally, the apiary inspectors are on our side, and they're there to help us, and they're free. They'll come out and they can help you figure out what's going on in your hive. So it's a really good thing to have a group at the state level helping out. The other group that's really helpful is the pesticide group, because we run into pesticides as well. And so unfortunately, I've had to call on those people, and they have been really, really helpful, and they're interesting people. So some things that you're going to need to do to get started in bees: you need to be trained. That's part of what this class is all about. You're going to need to have equipment. So today we're going to talk just a little about equipment, but next week we're really going to talk about equipment. You need to have space available. We'll talk about that a little later today. You need to be able to feed them because, the food sources, depending on where you are going to be unreliable. So plan on being able to do that. You're really going to need to be able to detect and treat for pests and viruses. And you're going to need to decide how you're going to use them. So if you're raising bees for pollination, that's one thing. If you're raising bees for honey, that's a totally different way of dealing with the bees. And like my neighbor, you may decide to sacrifice the bees for the honey. And you need to be able to commit time as needed. And I tell people you need to plan on being in your bees every 10 days to 2 weeks, or there's a pretty good chance that you're going to lose them, or you're going to have problems that you're going to have a hard time getting ahead of. So in training, things you're going to need to know. We're going to talk about later in this course, we'll talk about the colony, its organization, and the bee biology. So those are all things you're really going to need to know about. What equipment you'll need and the proper use of that equipment. What to do each month of the year. As I said, it changes from month to month across the year of what we do and what works, some months, and the other months don't work. How to keep your bees healthy and safe. And the big thing that took me about 2 years to learn, and I think it's probably the biggest stumper for new beekeepers, is learning to read the frames. So what does it mean to be able to read frames? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you about 13 or 14 slides. Every one of these, except for one, blessedly, I have seen in hives, either my hive or someone else's hive that I've gone out to help them with. And so these are just different things, and we're not going to really talk about what they are because we're going to during the course, we'll actually go back to each one of these slides and we'll really talk about what's going on with them. But there's things that you're going to see and you're going to need to know what it means. And as you're learning about bees, one of the reasons it takes so long is you'll start to see subtle changes heading for some of these things, and you'll need to be able to catch those subtle changes in order to get a hold of them, ahead of them. So here's the first slide. And this one actually is fairly common in hives. There's another one. This is the one that luckily I've never seen. This one's American foul brood, and I've never seen this one, so that's really a good thing. And when I said that, I've had hives that go in and, bring back varroa, this is actually a slide from that hive. I ended up losing that hive. So that's an indication of what can happen with varroa viruses. And I really like this saying. My friend Meredith got me this book, the Beekeeping, the Gentle Craft, and keeping bees is relatively simple, like raising children is relatively simple. That just speaks for itself. One of the things that you'll notice about hives, if you have more than one, every hive has its own personality. And there are days when you'll go out and you'll think you're going to do something really quick in the bees and be in and out in 20 minutes or something, and there'll be a totally different experience. You have to be prepared every time you get into them, just like when you're dealing with 2-year-olds or 4-year-olds. Okay, so this is the next part. Is we're going to get ready to order bees. So in the book, The Beekeeper's Handbook, and I like this book, but there are other books out there. I have lots of books, and even Beekeeping for Dummies is a good book. It's dated in a lot of ways, but a lot of the basics about things like equipment and stuff is still relevant. So chapter 4, Obtaining and Preparing for Bees, is really a good chapter to read in the Beekeeper's Handbook if you can get it. Okay, so the first thing is you're going to need to have space for the bees. So you need to think about that. Healthy colonies with 60 to 80,000 bees need about an acre of foraging space. Or you'll need to supplement food, and you'll probably need to do that anyway, but the less you have to do that, the healthier your bees will be. You need to make sure you can have bees on your property. When I first started in Texas, we weren't allowed to have bees in the urban areas. And so I was an apprentice to somebody who had bees in the country. Currently, since I've been in North Carolina, all of my bees have been on the farms of friends. So you need to make sure that if you can't have bees on your property, you have some place you can put them. But the other thing is, even if you can have bees on your property, you may be limited to how many colonies you can have. And if you do have bees on your property, you need to make sure your neighbors are okay with it. My experience has been, even if your neighbors think it's okay, they may put out pesticides that the bees will bring back, and that could be a problem. But the other thing that you should think about too is, even if you have bees on your own property and you have neighbors who do like mosquito prevention or other kinds of pesticide treatments, don't go to them and say, I have bees, you can't do this anymore, because that's just not ever going to work. But you can go to them and say, I have bees and I know you're doing this treatment. If you could let me know the night before the treatment is done so that I can lock my bees in for 24 hours, I really appreciate it. That'll help me protect my bees. And then you do that. So, they'll let you know that, treatment's coming tomorrow. You close the entrances on the hive during the night. The bees will be fine in there through the day. By the time you let them out the next evening, most of the moisture and the pesticide, that's been sprayed around is dissipated, and so it won't be a problem to the bees anymore. And your neighbors will think it's good that you're not judging them, and it'll be a way to start a conversation. So we need to be cognizant that people do things to take care of themselves, and we need to honor that. And so we can work with them. We're smart enough, we can figure out how to work with them. So that's one of the things that you need to do, is make sure if you're going to do bees on your property that your neighbors are okay with it. If you're putting bees on someone else's property, you need to know about their property maintenance practices. I had bees on a property in High Point, on the edge of a field that was being hayed by someone who they basically leased the property to somebody else. And they said they didn't use any kind of pesticides on the property. It turns out they used a broadleaf killer, so something like Roundup, on the property, and they would spray it in front of my hive. So that was a bit of a surprise and not good for my bees. And so you really need to understand about what they're doing to take care of their property. And they may not even realize that what they're doing can affect your bees. So get to know whoever you're putting bees on their property. And if it's a farm, you also need to know what they're growing and what their growing practices are. So the farm where I am and have been for a number of years now in Summerfield, he'll grow things. He grows a lot of like broccoli and kale and things like that, and he lets them go to flower, and the bees really like that a lot. And he also does a lot of squash and other things, cucumbers. But one of his big products is tomatoes, and honeybees don't really pollinate tomatoes. Bumblebees, you need something big to pollinate. So bumblebees are the big thing. So I don't count on that being their major food. So it's kind of good to know what they're growing and how they're growing it. If they're doing a lot in greenhouses, your bees are not going to be in the greenhouses for the most part. They really just don't go in there. The one thing I will say about the tomatoes is he grows heritage tomatoes, and sometimes there'll be one, as they're picking, they'll find one that's ugly, and they'll toss it and they'll get stepped on. And the bees like the juice. There's so much sugar in the heritage tomato juice that the bees actually like that. So it's always something new that we learn. Okay, so first you figure out where you're going to put your bees, and then you have to make sure that there's a good place to put the bees wherever it is you're going to put them. So there needs to be water nearby, but not under the hives. You really don't want hives sinking or having to squish around under the hives. Humidity is a real problem with hives, but it's nice to have water nearby. Or you need to provide water. Bees use a lot of water, so you need to make sure you provide water. You need some protection from the north wind. So if there's a good windbreak on the property, that's great. Or there's things that you can do during the winter, hay bales, or some kind of a protection, wrapping, whatever. You need to put them where they're in the open sunshine for most of the days. It used to be we'd put hives under trees, but now because of the varroa and the small hive beetle, we really need to have them in the sunshine for the most of the day, unless you're in the desert, and then that's just going to be a different altogether. They need to be accessible, so you need to be able to get to them. If you're hauling equipment and food and whatever, and you have to walk it in multiple trips, that could be a real issue. So being able to at least get a vehicle semi close to the bees is really important, or some way. For a while I had a wagon that I would use to haul stuff in one of the places that wasn't real easy to get to. And you need enough space to spread out if you need to. And one of the reasons for doing that is if you have multiple hives, is to eliminate drifting. So drifting is when bees from one hive sort of go to the next one. And so you end up with one really strong hive and one sort of pitiful hive. And that'll happen a lot when you're, especially when you're installing packages. And then it also helps cut down on robbing. So on page 57 in chapter 4, it talks about placing, different ways that you can set up your bee yard so that there's not a lot of drifting or robbing going on. And if you don't have the book, you can also just kind of Google, let me see, I'm just going to look real quick here. If you Google something like hive orientation to reduce drifting, you'll see some examples of different ways that you can set up your bee yard that'll make it easier. So that's all. And the other thing is setting up your bee yard so you have room to work. That's the other thing. So make sure you have enough space to spread out. So this is my bee yard in currently. So at one point in time, I had 4 of these stands and anywhere from 8 to 12 hives on them. And then across the street, one of the old farms, they sold and they're building big houses. And so then I started getting pesticide episodes. And so then I was down to 1 hive, and that was in the beginning of 2018. And now I'm back up to 4 hives. But you can see that there's distance between them, and they're also kind of kitty cornered. They're on an angle. And there's space in between the hives so that I can, when I'm picking up boxes and moving them, I have some place I can put them without putting them on the ground. Because it's, they're heavy, and so that'll save your back. So think about that. Think about where you're going to put them. When we talk about equipment in next week, we'll be talking about stands and different kinds of stands you can do, and more about placement and stuff, but that's something else to think about. Queens are one of the things when you're buying bees, you're going to be thinking about queens. Most of the queens in the United States right now are Italian. There's some variation on an Italian bee. Others in this area are Carniolan, Russian, and Buckfast. Most packages, and that's supposed to be nukes, not nuts. I thought I got them all, but anyway, most packages and nukes come with hygienic Italians. They're the easiest to work with, and I always say it's because they're the bees that read the books that we read. So the first year that I had bees, I had Carniolans because somebody said, "Oh, they're so great, and that's what they're easy to work with," and I love Carniolans, but they don't read the books. They don't. The thing about the Italians is they lay pretty much consistently. It's easy to tell what's going on. It's easy to find the queens, relatively speaking. Carniolans will do things like the queen will lay a lot and then she'll stop laying for a long time, and you'll think you killed her or you lost her. Go out and you'll buy a new one and put it in, and the bees will kill it because they already have a queen. And then all of a sudden she's laying again. So there's lots of, as you get to work with them, I really like them a lot. But any of these, you're gonna wanna get used to working with bees. And I just think Italian are the easiest ones to work with. So that's kind of just sort of a little bit of background on queens. Don't, as you're looking to buy queens, as you see that most of them are hygienic Italians, don't fret about that. Just go with it. That's my advice. The equipment you choose may affect how you get your bees. So in North Carolina, we have 4 types of hives, and they all have removable frames. And that's one of the rules. So like I said, beekeeping is now agricultural, and there are some restrictions. There are still people in various places who will find bees in a tree, and they'll just like cut out the tree and leave the bees in it. And for the most part, the apiary inspectors aren't going to go track them down or anything. It's not like moonshine, but those are just not things that we do very often. So the equipment that you're going to find readily available will have removable frames. So the most common one is the Langstroth hive, and that's the one that you see with the boxes everywhere. And so that's the most common one. And most of the beekeepers that you'll run into use the Langstroth hives. And so if you're looking for mentors and help, and that's a consideration. It comes in 5, 8, and 10 frame sizes, and I've done all of them. 10 frame sizes are really kind of too big for me, and so now I'm doing 5 and 8. And they come in 3 depths: deep, medium, and shallow. Now, the reason that you need to know this before you buy your bees is because if you decide you're going to buy a nuke, which is a nucleus colony, it's just a small version of a hive. It's typically 5 frames. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But most of them come in deep sizes with deep frames. And there's only one company locally that I know that even offers mediums. There used to be another one, but they've moved on. So, you know, so you're going to need to know. And you'll just need, next week we'll be talking more about equipment and the different things, and hopefully we'll have enough experienced beekeepers who can share how they came to pick whatever they're using and how that's working out for them. When I first started, I was doing 8 frames, all mediums. Now I'm doing 5 and 8 frame, deep, medium, and then shallows above them. That's just what I'm doing. And I'll talk more about why I do that later. So when you're looking at the brood frames, the one on the left is a deep. It's 9 1/8 inch deep, and the medium is 6 1/4. So if you're going to do medium equipment and you happen to get a nuke that has deep frames, it's not going to fit in the normal way, and there'll be other issues around that, and we'll be able to talk about that next week, but just something else to keep in mind. A lot of people are starting to go with top bar hives, and there are 2 kinds of top bar hives. There's the Kenyan, which is the one that's shown in the picture that has the sloping sides. The Tanzanian is straight sided, and it's more like the long hives that we currently have. And the way it works is in the Langstroth, it's a 4-sided frame, and the bees build up the wax between those frames so that it's all contained. Top bar hives, it's really just the top bar, and the bees build down. They build all the wax down, and it's not only got the top bar. And hopefully next week, someone that I know who has been doing top bars since 2011 successfully, she's the most successful person, will be along to talk a little bit about top bars and how to deal with top bars. The nice thing about a top bar hive is it's right at waist length, so you're not bending over, you're not having to pick up boxes and stuff, so that's something to consider. When you're buying bees, you're not going to buy a nuke probably, because finding someone who sells nukes for top bars is not easy. So you're probably going to be buying package bees. So that's one of the reasons why you have to have some clue before you purchase your bees what kind of equipment you're going to use. Another kind of equipment that is used is a Warre hive, and it's kind of a cross between a Langstroth and a top bar, in that they're boxes that you just keep adding, but they only have top bars, and then the bees build down from it. But they are removable, and so they can be inspected. There's one person I know who is fairly famous, who advocates for Warre hives. I've done sort of a modified Warre in my Langstroths, where I've done basically not just top bar, I do 3-sided. And we'll talk a little bit about that and touch on that when we talk more about equipment. But so you really could kind of do a Warre out of Langstroth equipment. And then one that's becoming popular is the horizontal or long hive. They use these a lot in Russia. You can get a horizontal hive that'll handle a deep Langstroth frame, or the real horizontal hives that they use in Russia are actually the frames are deeper than they are wide, which is different than the Langstreth deep. The Langstreth deep is wider than it is deep. So anyway, these are all really interesting. And again, you know, sort of at waist length, so you're not picking up and bending over and whatever. So this is one of the ones that I'm really interested in getting going, because as I get older, you know, lifting boxes is becoming a problem. So okay, and then you're gonna, once you kind of figure out where you're gonna put them, your neighbors are okay with it, you're feeling pretty good about where they're gonna go and how you're gonna set them up, you have some sense of what kind of equipment you're gonna go with, then you need to find bees to go in the hive. And there's 3 different ways you can get bees. You can get swarms, you can get a nuke, or you can get package bees. And package bees are 3 pounds of bees and a queen that come in a box. And they come in 2 different kinds of boxes, but the one below with the wooden screen is one of the more common ones. So a swarm is similar to a package, except you don't have any guarantees on what you're getting. So bees sometimes swarm because they're sick. They also swarm when they're making a new queen. And so the queen you may get may be an older queen. They may have viruses that come with them. You just never know. So different times a year, it's worthwhile to get a swarm. And you can't plan on it. So, you know, there are times when it seems like if we're, a lot of the beekeeping organizations have what they call swarm lists, so that when somebody reports a swarm, they'll call somebody and say, can you go get it? Sometimes it seems like a lot of those come in, sometimes you don't hear anything. So you can't count on it. So this is not, I wouldn't recommend this as a way of starting. Although I do have a story I will tell you next time about somebody who kind of started keeping bees this way. Packages are 3 pounds of bees and a laying queen. And 3 pounds are about 10 to 12,000 bees. And the bees are shaken from existing hives. Most of them that are coming now are coming from southern Georgia or South Carolina, where it's a little bit warmer. So they're shaking bees off of frames. The bees are not necessarily from the same hive. Not that that matters, they seem to be getting along just fine, but they're also adult bees. You don't get the same range of ages that you would get with, say, a nuke or once your hive is established. And the queen is not the queen the bees already know. She is a new queen, and so she's mated, and she'll be in a little box separately. So in the package, the bees are just getting acquainted with that queen and getting familiar with that queen. And you'll need to feed them even if there's a nectar flow on, because they're going to need to create a lot of wax and build comb, and so they need a lot of food. So that's one of the things with packages, is you're definitely going to need to feed them, and they may abscond or drift. And we'll talk a little bit next time about actually installing packages and also nukes. And we'll talk a little bit about things you can do to help with that. We've already talked about setting up the bee yard in a way to keep from, to minimize drifting, but there's some things you can do to keep them from absconding as well. Packages are available sooner than nukes because they're coming from, southern Georgia, someplace in the south. The best equipment where nukes are not readily available. So if you're doing a top bar or a Warre hive or something that's like a long hive that is using custom-made frames as opposed to the typical Langstroth hives, then you'll want to do a package. They're most readily available and the least expensive. And then on page 49 and 50 in the Beekeeper's Handbook book is more advantages and disadvantages about packages. And if you don't have the book, if you go to Bumbling Beekeeper, there's a post as well about packages or nukes, advantages and disadvantages. So you can look at that. Nukes are typically 3 frames of brood plus 1 or 2 frames of honey and pollen with a laying queen. So it's really just a mini hive. It's everything the bees need. They come in deep or medium-sized frames, mostly deep. They already have drawn comb and food, so you may not need to feed them as much. And if you get them during, when things are blooming, they may not even be interested in the food because they're going to prefer the food outside. And the bees are all stages. So you will have emerging bees coming out. You'll have foragers, you'll have, and we'll be talking down the road about life cycle of the bees, but you'll have house bees, you'll have all that. So, if you're doing Langstroth or you're doing long hives that use, Langstroth frames, then nukes are not a bad idea. And there are more advantages and disadvantages, again, on page 50 and 51, or read my post. And the one thing I will say before I talk about this slide, with nukes in particular, you're probably going to get them from somebody who's a local beekeeper or local beekeeping company. And so there's a relationship there. And so it's usually pretty good quality. And you'll be able to, if you have issues, you can usually go back to the person that you're getting them from. There are a couple of folks in North Carolina who keep bees for pollination. And so right now the bees are in California for the almond pollination, and they'll be back early March. And some of those the bees come back packed with pollen from the almond trees. And so they're ready to split and to swarm. And so a lot of times these folks will sell nukes, 4 or 5 frames of bees and food. And the queen's usually the queen that's a year old, because they're requeening, and their queens actually continue to lay all year round, whereas your queen will not lay from late fall until early spring. And so she'll get a little bit of rest in there. So these queens, and they've been exposed to who knows what. And if you aren't an experienced beekeeper, I would recommend that you don't buy from one of these people unless you have an experienced beekeeper to go with you. I know people who have bought from people whose main business is pollination, and they've ended up with European foul brood or chalk brood, or other kinds of brood issues. So that's just a suggestion, just from experience and people that I know. So when you can get swarms, they're free unless they're sick. Package of bees, 3 pounds of bees plus the queen are running $118 to $150 these days. Nukes are running $170 to $200. Most of the ones that I've seen recently are $170 or $175. So where do you order your bees? Well, if you go to my Bumbling Beekeeper website, the first post is order your bees, and I've made it sticky. And so I've added a list, and I'm updating it as I hear from various people, but I've got a list of people where you can buy packages and nukes. And, with the cold weather that we've been having, the dates are moving back probably about 2 weeks. So we're a little later getting packages than we normally are in the year. But that's kind of good for us because, by the time your bees get here, you'll have a little more learning under your belt, which you'll find helpful. And also another reason for doing this is it's letting people know other people in the area who are keeping bees, so you have a resource of people you can go to and ask questions. So that's always really helpful. And then the other thing is the Department of Agriculture actually has a list of apiaries authorized to sell bees in North Carolina. And if you go, when you look at the post on my website, at the bottom, there's actually a clickable link that goes to their list of people who have been permitted to sell bees in North Carolina. So that's a really good one. And some of it is even people outside of the state. So, you'll see Georgia, you'll see South Carolina, you'll see one from Texas and other places as well. So it's really kind of a good resource. So that's kind of the things you need to start thinking about this week. Next week, we'll be talking more about hardware. And so that'll get you going. you know, we're trying to get you to the point where you can order your bees soon, because what you'll find is there are, you know, you like nukes in particular, they'll get sold out fairly quickly. So anyway, so that's part of that. And coming attraction. So just to let you know what's coming over the next 8 weeks, well, 10 weeks, but 8 classes. So next week we'll start with questions. So bring your questions. We're gonna talk about equipment, woodenware, so the 4 different kinds of equipment. We're gonna talk about protective clothing. My rule in my bee yard is you have to, you at least have to wear a veil. You can be naked, but you gotta at least wear a veil. Protect your eyes. If, bees, even though we have domesticated them in the sense that we're caring for them and that's how we're keeping them alive, they are still wild animals. And you know, there'll be days when you get in the hive and you'll go, whoa, that's not what I expected. So if you get stung in the eye, you can go blind. So I just absolutely require people to wear headgear, some kind of veil. Tools, different things, smokers, hive tools, things that you're going to need. And then we're also going to talk about how to install packages in nukes. So that's week 2. Week 3, March 7th, we'll start with questions. We'll talk about races of honeybees. Those are things like, you know, Italian, Carniolan, Russian, Buckfast. There's a whole bunch of different ones. We'll do some basic honeybee biology, you know, the different parts of the bee. We'll talk about life cycle of the honeybee. That's really important and really interesting. Week 4 is, you know, questions, more bee biology. We'll actually be going inside the bee. The first one we talk about is basically external. The second one is more like the actual guts of the bees and what's going on inside, but also a little bit more detail about some of the things like, you know, their eyes and things like that. And then we'll talk about pheromones, because bees are all about smell. Week 5, more questions, and we're going to talk about pest diseases and pesticides. And that's kind of a hard one, but you know, being prepared, and there really are a handful of things you absolutely will see, and you need to be prepared for them. We're also going to talk a little bit about different things you got to think about in urban beekeeping. Week 6 is Palm Sunday and also during spring break. So I'm going to do this as a kind of a catch up with questions, and whatever you want to talk about, we can do whatever you want to do this week. No class on April 4th. Week 7, again, we'll start with questions. We're going to talk about working in the hives. And this is where we actually talk about how you actually do inspections in the hive, things that you'll be looking for, different ways that you handle equipment while you're in the hives. It's different from a Langstroth hive than it is a top bar hive. And then we're going to start talking about seasonal management, and we're going to talk about spring seasonal management in particular, because we will be in spring. Hopefully by then everything will be really wonderful. So then week 8, we'll continue with seasonal management. We're going to talk about summer, fall, and winter management. So there's always something to do. Week 9 is going to be products of the hive: honey, wax, propolis, pollen, bee venom, and wax moth larvae that people actually raise for fishing. So, and my friend Janice is supposed to come and help us with this one, because she does a lot of using products of the hive in some of her various products that she sells, and honey and different things like that. So that's kind of the lineup for the class. And so that's everything. And so next week we'll be talking about equipment and, you know, actual clothing and things that we need. So come back and bring your questions.